Once there were brook trout in the streams in the mountains. You could see them standing in the amber current where the white edges of their fins wimpled softly in the flow. They smelled of moss in your hand, polished and muscular and torsional. On their backs were vermiculate patterns that were maps of the world in its becoming. Maps and mazes of a thing which could not be put back, not be made right again. In the deep glens where they lived, all things were older than man, and they hummed of mystery.
Of a thing that could not be put back. It's amazing how such small words from the likes of Cormac McCarthy can resonate in such a significant way. Over the years, my relationship with brook trout could only be defined as, well, weird. Many of my favorite boyhood memories emanate from hours of carefree casting on the many mountain lakes and streams of the western United States, specifically in the Front Range of colorful Colorado. Blame it on the ignorance of youth, because at the time, it really never registered. I was fully convinced these speckled beauties were just another magical part of the high alpine ecology and had been lovingly placed there with some divine hand. As I've aged, the veil of youth was unceremoniously smacked off my head. A lot of the western destinations I now travel to see these hungry char as nothing more than a mistake from yesteryear's fisheries mismanagement.
That is so nice.
Despite their generosity towards a fly, they are often number one on the wanted list of invasive salmonids, constantly encroaching on the fragile ranges of native western trout species. I certainly see where the subpar sentiment stems, but to me, they're always beautiful. I try not to bemoan this bycatch too much, because at the end of the day, they make for some great table fare.
There we go. Yeah, baby. That's a good fish. That fish. Wow, look at those freaking colors, man.
Deep down, I've always held a certain fascination with brook trout swimming east of the Mississippi. Their native range runs far and wide, but for some reason, my wayward double hauls have seldom flown where they call home.
You guys see the dimensions on this thing? That is a beautiful brook trout.
Barring a small bunch of brook trout I've stumbled into throughout the Driftless and Great Lakes region, I've never really been able to experience this fish in its natural environment. With spring right around the corner, it was maybe time for that to change. Over the next 3 months, I'm taking a headfirst dive into the deep end of the Southern Appalachian Mountains. Mind you, nearly everything east of the muddy Mississippi will be fully foreign to my fresh eyes. The primary reason for making this trip is to fix my relationship with the aforementioned brook trout, and more specifically, fostering a new connection with the Southern Appalachian strain that calls these mysterious mountains home. When it's all said and done, I hope to make a positive change in the eyes of as many anglers as possible and raise awareness for these special fish. For those just as unfamiliar with this region as I was, my boots will stay wet from North Georgia all the way up to Southern Virginia and everywhere in between. My own personal goal for this excursion is to catch one brook trout specimen from each of the states in which it's native. Of course, the side mission will be to document everything else I experience along the way. This is set to be a fish-focused film that attempts to untangle some of the misconceptions and current issues surrounding America's first game fish. This was a massive opportunity to learn, and hopefully at the end of it all, to make a difference in the future of brook trout. But in order to organize all the research and give each region the time it so deserves, this native fish story will be broken down into chapters. Starting off with the prologue, it only seems right to discuss Salvelinus fontinalis. What even is a brook trout? Once some context is built, I'll dive into chapter 1 and take a look at the states who are so well known for their peaches and palmetto. Moving further north, the other Carolina will be the focus for chapter 2. And it only seemed right to give the most visited national park in the country its own chapter, so that will be discussed in 3. Rivaled only by the likes of North Carolina, chapter 4 will take a look at the streams of the Volunteer State. Finishing things up, Virginia is the uppermost limits of the Southern Clades and will be the final fish-focused chapter. If you can manage to stick around that long, the epilogue will hopefully tie everything together with a nice bow and maybe show you, the viewer, ways in which you can help. Before proceeding any further, I'd like to offer up a small warning. This is set to be an in-depth story with many overlapping parts. For those of you that have had the patience and are still watching, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude for your constant support with these longer videos. Not too dissimilar from every other thing you see posted on this channel, but a great deal of effort went into the research, fishing, filming, and eventual editing of what you are watching now. I still work a full-time job, so dedicating the time it takes to make this all happen is by no means an easy feat. Just know that every like and comment helps with the algorithm, and the more of you that subscribe, the more it allows films like this to be made, so maybe consider subscribing. I really hate to push all that stuff, but that's just the weird game of YouTube. Regardless, I really hope you enjoy the fishing and scenery of springtime in this magical part of the world, and most of all, I hope you learn as much about the Southern Appalachian brook trout as I have. My name is Mike, and this is a Fly All Season story. Like I mentioned, before jumping in the water, some context is needed. What even is a brook trout? Shown above is a wild rainbow trout caught deep in the Appalachian Mountains, and below is a wild and native brook trout caught in the same exact stream. Both have spineless pectoral fins, dorsal fins, and the always fan favorite adipose fin. You can see too that the eyes, jaws, and gill plates all follow a similar blueprint, creating a hydrodynamic ball of muscle that fits right in at the top of any food chain. Even though it's technically called a trout, Salvelinus fontinalis is actually considered to be a member of the char family, known to many by many different names. Speckled trout, coasters, squaretails, and specks are all closely related to some other rather iconic North American gamefish species that you might recognize. Starting off with big brother bull trout, these piscivorous predators sure can grow to immense proportions, and I've been lucky enough to tango with them way out in the Mountain West.
All of that is what Idaho dreams are made out of. At least mine.
Lurking in depths that make it pretty tricky to target with a fly rod, lake trout are another one of my favorite char species, and I've found them in some rather pretty places.
Another laker in the honey hole. I don't know how we got so lucky, man.
The last two on the list, Dolly Varden and Arctic char, are slightly out of reach for now, but are high on my list of fish to target here in North America. Now that we know the family tree a bit better, let's get back to our side-by-side comparison here. Both of these fish belong to the Salmonidae family. The real nuts and bolts difference between the two isn't nearly as intriguing as some might think. Most of the physical differences could be summed up to subtle at best. As far as the outer appearance goes, most trout can be characterized as having light bodies with dark spots. You can see our little rainbow friend above and his counterparts have a creamy white base with a smattering of blue par marks and black spots running from nose to tail. Char, on the other hand, sport a much darker body that are often interrupted with lighter spots. You may also see more black and white stripes adding character to their outer fins. Going back to our original specimen for this example, this lovely speck sports a deep olive and green vermiculation that contrasts so well with the yellow, red, and orange polka dots spanning from cheek to flank. Outside of physical characteristics, another decisive way to distinguish a char from a trout has to do with geographic range, as well as the overall niche filled within a particular watershed. With that in mind, now is as good a time as any to zoom in on the southeastern United States, seeing as this is where the entirety of the following video will be taking place. The deep green of the surrounding forest holds no end of distraction for the wandering eye. Flocks of birds sing in the thick canopy, while the wandering Ursus americanus mine the forest floor. Water oozes from every crevice, and salamanders thrive in the rainforest like underbrush. Follow your ears where the slopes converge these trickles and transform them into the sound of rushing water. Moving with purpose, these cold and clean streams hold a very valuable indicator species. Often, they don't require much room, so any pathetic looking pool could be full of Southern Appalachian brook trout eagerly awaiting their next meal. Different clades of the southern strain can be found from Georgia all the way north into Virginia and are considered distinctly different from their mid-Atlantic and New England counterparts. Unique is a word frequently used, but doesn't quite do them justice. Millions of years ago, when the ancestors of rainbow trout on the west coast were pushing deep into the interior of what we now call a country, precursors of the brook trout were doing the same exact thing, just here on the east coast. Surely, megafauna like mastodons, short-faced bears, and American lions were all unknowing witnesses to the Herculean journey of these anadromous fish. Evidence still present in their gill plates lead biologists to believe that somewhere around 2 million years ago, during the Pleistocene era, these once oceanic fish ran themselves into isolation all throughout this ancient mountain range. With the many interconnecting watersheds across the region, there was a time where these fish were able to display both stream resident and fluvial life histories. It should come as no surprise, but here in the last 200 years, things like dams, non-native introductions, overfishing, habitat loss, and many other intersecting issues have all but decimated the once robust stocks of these unique North American char. But I'll be sure to touch on all of that in much greater detail later on in the video.
So I know it seems a bit odd to be spending this much time talking about one particular fish, but why are these fish so important?
Man, I mean, brook trout just live in an awesome place. You know, you come into these headwater streams, and I always tell people there's not many places left in our world where you can catch brook trout in their natural environments, relatively unimpaired by people. And so why is that? Well, these places need cold water. They need intact ecosystems, intact forests, low sedimentation, you know, and good, decent water quality. And so not just for brook trout, but for salamanders, you know, for the insects that live there. These special places are unfortunately being imperiled every day. And so to be able to come to the Smokies or West North Carolina National Forest or Tennessee National Forest and find these is a pretty special thing. Brook trout need certain habitat features that are hard to find elsewhere. And when you find them, when you find fish there, you know that that's a really healthy ecosystem and something special to hold on to.
So hopefully moving forward, we all have a more cursory understanding of the main subject. Now we can really crack into the meat and potatoes of the story. Let's dive into Chapter 1. Chapter 1. Peaches and Palmetto.
These are really tempting pools, but with it being so close to the access point, I don't know. This might get fished out. I like this water though. This is nice. Nice big pools. This seems like a good place to start. Good enough as any, I suppose. Time to get cold, I guess.
Prior to touching down in the proper South, the ATL trap scene, SEC football, and maybe some tangy BBQ would be what comes to mind when someone mentions Georgia or South Carolina. Of course, peaches and palmettos are a bit more poetic. I wouldn't find myself in many orchards or anywhere near the coast to witness these more famous monikers. Just a mere stone's throw from massive cities like Atlanta and Greenville will land you deep in the mountains. If you chase the sound of rushing water, there's a chance you'll find a few fish and are guaranteed to reach solitude. With well over 4,000 miles of cold water streams running between both states, most folks might not recognize the trout fishing opportunities this far south in the United States. The Chattahoochee, Conestoga, and Toccoa rivers are some of the more well-known systems throughout Georgia, and in a similar manner, South Carolina is known for the Chattooga, Whitewater, and Watauga rivers. They are all fine fisheries from what I hear, but are mostly stocked or have become wild streams now after those historic non-native stockings.
This is great. I don't even know if I can get around this. for every inch out here. Golly. Things got way too narrow, so I guess it's game over for this section. Time to find some new water.
Primarily found in the cold water tributaries of the Blue Ridge portions of each state, this is where my primary focus will remain. The shared strongholds for brook trout are often isolated, but continue to get encroached upon by non-native trout.
All right, these must be the falls right here. I wonder if there's any fish here.
While this video is being filmed, the systems in which native brook trout can still be found is but a mere pittance of what it once was. From all my research and first-hand accounts, your overall chances to experience these fish would increase the further you can get into the more rugged portions of the surrounding mountains. You can make your own conclusions on the overall health of these shared states. From an outsider looking in, things seem a bit grim, but before landing on a glass half empty consensus, it would be best to get my boots on the ground and give the situation a closer look with my own two eyes. The Blue Ridges of North Georgia are still an awfully wild corner of the Appalachian Mountains. This fact was made immediately evident as soon as I strayed away from the trail this morning. Making any headway along this little blue line was going to be an absolute bear.
How's a fella supposed to get through here?
Piles of downed trees and overreaching rhododendron made every inch gained feel like an hour lost. When I would break out of the suffocating foliage, the pools throughout this stream looked a little small, but just big enough to maybe hold a fish. Early on, my rusty bow and arrow casting was simply met with silence, and it didn't take long to experience the sharp learning curve associated with tight quarters. The fishy activity was encouraging, but a flash of fluoro caught my eye and made my heart sink again. What in the hell were bait fishermen doing on this stream? I knew this might be an issue coming into Georgia, but all the way up here, and how'd they even get up this far? This was no doubt discouraging, and if not for this next pool, I might have just turned around right there and looked for new water.
You're not supposed to be up here.
Shuffling upstream, I couldn't help but think about how my extensive research might have failed me. Trust in older publications helped me break the skunk on a non-native rainbow. Wild, yes, but he shouldn't be here. After each slippery pile of logs I hurtled over, I cursed the air and said it'd surely be my last. But something kept pushing me forward for whatever reason. Maybe call it a gut feeling. Scanning with a critical eye, something about the residual debris from this timber pileup flashed like metal in the sun and caught my eye.
Whoa. That was a dry fight.
Carrying 2 rods can be an awful chore, but it's situations like this where it's made worth it. The parachute ant on my 5-weight was a touch too big, but a bushy caddis on my 3-weight proved to be the perfect size. After a rather enthusiastic hook set, I quickly cradled this native gem and settled in to get a better look.
Yes! Let's freaking go.
Taking a look underneath, this log overhang was the ideal spot. Hovering just underneath, in a slight hydro pocket, a fish could sit in this seam using minimal energy, while at the same time having full access to the buffet of food flowing downstream. If there was one, well, maybe there'd be more. So I felt confident enough to maybe go a little bit further to see if I could find one more fish before my route gets completely blocked off. Even though it's not necessary, I should have maybe done this earlier in the day. It's always good to practice no matter where you are, to do a little digging and see what forage might be around for these fish to munch on. Quite an array of mayflies and the odd caddis, so not too terribly far off from what I was tossing. That would seem to be a collapsed and mostly failing fish barrier. It was only fitting that I pulled out a couple quick wild rainbows, one on the dry and another on the nymph. I kept casting with the hope of sifting through and finding the target species. And sure enough, with just enough patience, my Copper John finally hit the mark. With Georgia being a fair distance from my regional base camp, I'm so happy to have tracked down a specimen like this. Overall, sporting a darker than average body, the distinct bars of the longer par markings really resonated with my eyes. The yellow spots blended into the fine vermiculation along the back, and not to be overlooked, but the subtle red spots surrounded by the iconic blue halos were some of the more smaller ones I'd end up seeing throughout this trip. Well, see you, pal. Best of luck down there.
Well, I'm happy to say I caught some Georgia brook trout, but I would not recommend this creek. This is so hard to maneuver and downright dangerous, man. This is, yeah, this is rough. Oh.
With the ever-important task of actually making it back to the truck, my mind couldn't help but put the cart before the horse a bit and focus on the next task at hand. If I could withstand falling into the water or impaling myself on these sharp branches, South Carolina would be the next mark to check off my list. Clearly, I was capable of maneuvering and fishing this kind of water, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I want to next time. This was a real grind. A glimpse at a map will show you the sheer amount of private land in this part of the world. It's hard to see the forest from the trees when you're states away just studying maps, but after finally touching down and seeing it with my own 2 eyes, I found it all to be quite interesting. Sign after sign, meticulously marking those precious property lines, led me all the way to the much anticipated National Forest land. It was weird to say that this was the very first time I'd ever spent time in state number 8 of this fine union. So this is South Carolina.
This is already so different than Georgia. You can actually walk. That was it. That was the South Carolina brook trout. That's a brook trout. That's a brook trout. That's a brook trout. Yes, unbelievable. Oh, there he goes. Just like that, out of the box.
A fair mix of sand and river rock lined the bed, and this stream was proving to be a much easier walk than its neighbor across the borderline. Instead of battling for every step and hoping to find one fish, it was nice to sit back knowing the pressure was off. My eyes couldn't help but focus in on the signs of spring all around me. The foliage itself, it was coming in fast, but I could still see the remnants of a few restoration projects that took place in the previous decades. And even though every pool wasn't jam-packed with fish, the positive results of this hard work were still present and hard to deny. The riparian overhang acted as the perfect buffer for pesky predators like myself, but it seemed like as long as there was an opening along this forest fortress, there was a chance a fish might be loitering within casting distance. Using the fish box, I was able to get a much better look at this South Carolina brook trout with minimal to no contact required. It's always amazing to me how, given the right angle, the sun could illuminate a whole new spectrum of meticulously placed scales and reveal often unseen color waves in these incredible fish. Satisfied to see him swim back no worse for wear, I continue my path upstream. So far, my dedicated dry fly setup on the old leaf cutter was proving to be appealing for the King Creek residents.
So, starting to get a little bit thick. I'm gonna hop in the truck and maybe go downstream, see what we can't see. Oh, no, there he goes.
The smaller fish in the system were far from intimidated by the sizable bug on the end of my line. I saw each fish as a worthy data point to add to the spectrum of specimens I'd seen so far. Moving upstream, I would commit to 1 or 2 solid casts at prospective runs before moving on. If there happened to be anyone home, you would almost immediately see the shadows darting below in a race to get acquainted with the newest morsel that dropped onto their doorstep. This is a fast way to fish, and you may do more walking than you do casting. That's my general strategy that I like to follow, but I'm always willing to take that risk in order to cover lots of water.
Holy wow. This is getting thicker than a Snicker up now. Oh man, it's getting tight. It is getting tight. Let go of me. Oh, that's a thicket right there, man. Good God. That's a good fish. That's a really good fish. Oh my lid! Oh my God! Look at you, Buster Brown. Woohoo!
It may seem silly to say, but folks, that's a nice fish. Just from the jaw structure alone, I can tell right away that this is a much older trout. Pool boss? No. I think this might be the pool CEO. All of his physical features are sized up, and I counted 6. I'm talking 6 orange speckles on the canvas-like dorsal fin. What an absolute specimen. It's really strange to think that this spawning age fish might only be 2 or 3 years old, and most likely it won't swim past its 4th winter. Just purely based on the conditions, from egg to smolt and smolt to adult, these fish don't exactly have an easy road ahead of them. Man, good luck, big guy. I sure hope you make it through the season and pass on those resilient genetics. The long stretching sandy bottom allowed me to spy on a few more fish as the evening wore on, and after that massive brookie, I can honestly say I had no real interest in doing any more casting. As I made my way out, I couldn't help but get a little distracted by the potential for forest floor amphibians, and on just my 2nd log flip, I was lucky enough to come across my first salamander out east. Talk about a cherry on top of a day. Now, where I went, I wouldn't classify Georgia or South Carolina as easy. With a few specimens from each state well documented and success hard to deny, I could continue on to the next chapter of this story. But before I do move along with this story, I'd like to offer up a quick PSA. Trash, junk, garbage, litter, rubbish, whatever you call it, there's almost no avoiding it in these odd modern times. Cheap plastic leaching into the water or corroding cans lining the places we like to play, it can all make for a real eyesore. It takes no time at all to toss by the wayside your unneeded waste, and bending over to inspect someone's mystery trash can seem like a lot of effort. One lazy man's garbage often ends up being a burden on the collective, but we ought to strive for the better. There should be no excuse for discarding anything in wild places. If you pack it in, pack it out.
Well, howdy folks. I figured now would be a good time to talk about this because as I've been in the southeast, I've been finding a lot of trash. And as y'all know, I carry a handy dandy red bag here to put away any trash that I see when I'm out on the water. And I know it might seem kind of dumb or maybe a waste of time because it's like, well, someone's gonna throw some more out there, or yeah, it's like, what's one bottle? But I don't know. I'd like to think it makes a difference, and it's really about setting precedents so that the kiddos coming up can see that, you know, this is the right way to conduct yourself on the water. You know, grab some cans, grab some bottles, whatever it may be, hike it out and make the places we like to explore better than when we found them. So yeah, that's my little quick trash PSA, folks. I will stop talking now and let's get back to the fishing.
Chapter 2, Tar Heel Trout. Days were seemingly getting longer, but I couldn't help feel the self-imposed weight of pressure. The hike in was a handful, no doubt, and I'd be trapped on this trail for the better part of an hour. The silver lining of the scenery around was at least soft on the eyes and well worth the walk. Just from what I've seen and heard, this was the place you wanted to be if brook trout was your business.
I think this is it. If I had to guess. Oh, there's a fish right there. Look at you, Magoo. It's always a fish at the crossing hole.
The boys in powder blue tossing the rock over in Chapel Hill, or those faithful brothers in flight, are often the images conjured up when thinking of number 12 in the Union. But with well over 3,000 miles of trout streams running through North Carolina, in many circles, this is considered the center hub of Southern Appalachian angling. All throughout the year, folks flock to Asheville, Bryson City, and Boone alike, looking to get on a bite. The Tuckasegee and Nantahala River are quite well known, along with others like Davidson and South Mills Creek. But most of those contain non-native trout species like rainbows or browns, and that's not really what I'm after.
I mean, how is a fella supposed to fish this, man? This is ridiculous.
The native populations of brook trout in North Carolina are primarily found in the central Piedmont region and especially in the more mountainous portions of the far western end of the state. With the Great Smoky Mountain National Park and large sections of national forest preserving valuable headwater streams, North Carolina state fish has managed to hold out better than most. Those faint shadows moving amongst the sand, gosh, it had to be made by the torpedo-like shape of a trout, or that's at least what I told myself. I was beginning to question the claims of robust populations with each empty cast. The night was young, and I had a feeling something was bound to bite. I just had to be in the right place at the right time.
Yes!
Man, it may not show, but I really had to work for this one, and it's a shame to think I've got the wrong fish. I could easily sit here and claim that this was my first Southern Appalachian brook trout here in North Carolina, but I'd be lying to you, and I'd be lying to myself. Subtle differences, criticized by the more experienced eye, might be able to distinguish this imposter. I'm not that guy, so I'll go ahead and lean on historic stocking records as my guiding light. This beautiful wild brook trout is simply the remnants of a northern strain fish that was stocked over southern genetics many decades ago. Looks like my hunt for the southern strain still continues.
Oh my god, you're so big. Oh my gosh. Why are you this big? That's unreasonably big. Bufo, my goodness gracious. What?
In the world of shifting baselines, it's important to recognize that being the best of the worst still isn't all that great. Despite this state being at the forefront of Southern Appalachian brook trout management, my pointless hike out was rather melancholy knowing the towering hurdles a lot of these isolated populations still needed to jump over. In order to avoid being hyperbolic of the situation as a whole, let me show you what I was able to see throughout my time here in the Tar Heel State. Getting up and out well before the sun, my goal for the day was to run fast towards the sound of rushing water. To my right, paralleling this wide earthen trail, was supposed to be one of, if not the best wild brook trout stream in the entire Nantahala National Forest. It could have been the excited nerves of a new adventure or the growing incline, but my palms were starting to sweat and I was already on my second layer shed of the morning. I thought it peculiar at the time. This path to the headwaters was wide and really well maintained, all things considered. Almost immediately my hackles were up and my gut feeling was screaming out that there must have been some sort of industry presence before this belonged to the National Forest. Sure as the sun, a bit of research revealed that prior to the 1920s, logging companies had cut their way deep into the heart of this ominous land. Tough to tell if the series of culverts diverting flows were part of the original road build. It's been so long, they very well could have been installed by the Forest Service of yesteryear. This old car, however, yeah, that jalopy was most certainly a relic of more industrial times. Who knows how many years of old growth this rusty box of metal dragged out throughout its life. Almost ironic to think of its now idle state. Without a doubt, its fate was sealed, never to be moved again. Distractions aside, I was making good time as the deafening sound of falling water came in and then faded out. During the research process, I found that 3 large waterfalls in Big Snowbird Creek act as the natural barriers that have managed to protect the native brook trout from the incursion of downstream invaders. The lower and middle fall sections are supposed to have some good fish, but I wanted to get above as many cascades as possible and see the most undisturbed and seldom fished for char. With the sunbeams reaching through the trees and biting at my heels, I buckled down and pushed hard to finish out the last few miles of this hike.
Well, the trail's taking me up a series of switchbacks. The river is way down there. I'm high up on the hill, and holy cow, this is kicking my butt. Hey, bear. Hey, bear. Hopefully it is all downhill from here. Good Lord. It's funny, the further up I've gone, the more wilderness this trail's become. It's not very well maintained, and it doesn't seem like a whole lot of folks make it up this way. Now that's a set of falls. Holy cow. Yeah, that's a nice natural barrier. Jeez Louise. Wow. Yeah, I think this will do. It's beautiful. All right, waiting booths are on. It's time to catch some fish.
Or at least I thought it was time to catch fish. I did my best to scan the water with a critical gaze, hoping for a visible twitch in the shadows. Ginger steps jostled for solid footing amongst the stream bed boulders to no real effect. I've heard you can't surprise a phantom. Trying to sneak up on something that just isn't there, it really felt silly. Hailing from Missouri, I'm a show-me guy to my core, and right now, Big Snowbird wasn't giving me anything to work with. Could it still be too early for these fish? That's usually my knee-jerk reaction, but it just doesn't seem right. If there were fish present at the higher elevations, everything in me thought they'd be more than willing to pick up what I was putting down. Still holding a skunk, I remember seeing piled up leaves back on the trail, and now that had me worried as well. Not but a few days ago, a torrential downpour came through and put most of western North Carolina in a watery chokehold. Sitting on my porch, I contemplated how the quantity and speed at which the clouds poured over the land was like nothing I'd ever seen. Severe flash flooding is one of the natural threats to brook trout populations in this part of the world. In one foul swoop, entire generations can be washed away in seconds. How ironic would it be if I hiked all this way just to fish an empty stream? Continuing upstream efforts, I switched back and forth between my solo dry fly rod and the trusty dry dropper to only be met with silence as I aimlessly stumbled on. Man, what gives? Looking in the water, I could see a fair amount of bug life and what looked to be some smaller forage fish too. I would hate to be critical, but my bugs were almost a one-for-one match of what was clinging to the rocks. Right as the vines of frustration started to creep in and coil like kudzu, a flash of crimson woke up my tired eyes, and that heavy skunk was no longer sitting so hard on my shoulders. I tell you what, the sharp reds contrasting against the deep olive were something the camera just couldn't quite do justice. I I really wish y'all could have seen this work of art with your own two eyes. Talk about a fine specimen to document for my first official Southern Appalachian brook trout here in North Carolina. This relic of the past shot back into the fast water, no worse for wear, and now I had high hopes I'd be seeing a few more of his friends as the day grew long.
Nice. It's a tangibly better fish.
Taking a much needed load off, rehydrating was at the top of my to-do list, and I couldn't help but ponder the day up until this point. Sitting down and observing things around me, it seemed as though the underbrush bordering the creek began to move in unison. All it took was the soft kiss of springtime sun to kickstart the engine of life up in the hills. Terrestrial bug life was abound, and there seemed to be quite a few aquatic insects hatching, or attempting to hatch in the now midday warmth. Lesson learned. If there are no bugs moving in the cold of dawn, then why would any self-respecting brook trout be looking to the surface for a meal? There was no end of hydro pocket hideaways to just hunker down behind and linger long until lunch. This morning, it must have been a fluke, and witnessing all this in front of me was proof enough. Now, I could be off on that assumption, but I wasn't going to let that stop my upstream march. I was here for one reason, and I still had more North Carolina brook trout to rope in. The more I pushed into the headwaters, the better and better the water seemed to be. A painful pit of regret started to grow in my stomach, knowing that my impatience earlier in the day meant I was going to miss out on some really fine water. This was another prime pool, and just from a quick scan, I could tell there might be a fish or two down there. At this point, I was casting with confidence, and I was nearly sure of a hookup, but I wasn't expecting to catch my favorite fish of the day. Hopefully you can notice that there are slight variations displayed in each of the clades. Subtle as they may seem, something about the phenotype differences in the Tar Heel trout truly stuck out. Those blue halos hovered so faint around the scarlet speckles, and the oblong yellow and olive spots seemed to rain down from the vermiculated clouds lining the muscular back. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd hate to project, but in my mind, this is a speckled trout well worth any amount of miles. What an absolute gem. As he slid back, it has to be acknowledged that I probably could have brought quite a few more fish to hand. I simply just whiffed or was too slow. A few of these empty swings were no doubt pushing that 10 to 12 inch range, which again is about as good as you can do in this corner of the world. The sting of that loss would have been made a whole lot worse if not for the ones I did manage to get to the net. This fine specimen was set to be the last one of the day. As I gazed past the plexiglass, there was an internal wrestling match with the many different thoughts running through my mind. How old was this fish? And how long had he and his ancestors been trapped up here? And most of all, were your genetics still pure from the Pleistocene? Those menacing waterfalls would be difficult for any critter to get up and around, so the prospect of isolation stuck in my craw while I cradled him for the final release. Good luck down there, buddy.
Alright, just dropped everything. This is where I set up this morning and started fishing, so I'm gonna break everything down, change, and get the heck out of here, because this is gonna be a long hike back.
Well, all the books and articles, they weren't lying. This was one of the best representations I'd seen so far of a healthy, high-elevation brook trout fishery. Where I was set to go next, well, it couldn't be much further from Big Snowbird Creek. This concept of delayed harvest isn't something you run across all too much west of the Mississippi, but many an Asheville angler clued me in on the various forks of the Mills River system and said it'd be worth a look. Full transparency, these kind of streams, they aren't really my cup of tea, but I had an extra evening and my good buddy Matt was traveling through the area for work, so we decided to link up. What could be the harm of one quick evening session?
Oh shit. Do you see that? There's a 12-inch brook trout like right there. That's too funny. He was just chilling right here. Oh, there goes another one. I guess, no, dude, we spooked him for sure. I said, let's keep moving up.
Months prior, during my extensive research phase for this entire journey, I determined it would be in my best interest to avoid these kind of creeks. Wild and native brook trout were my primary goal, so I've got to imagine those haven't been present in a watershed like this for many generations. Completely shifting gears from wild, high-elevation fish, I had to reach deep into my stock trout duffel bag to trick some of these cement-raised and highly pressured fish. Well, the skunk was off, but at what cost? This was technically the biggest brook trout I've caught this entire trip, but I can't say I looked at this mutant with any sort of accomplishment. Good luck down there, dude.
Jeez. Oh man, that was so sick. If he could do that again, I'll zoom right in on his ass. Oh my god, that was so cool. Golly Jones, there he was again. I mean, just last second he wants it. There he goes.
My bias is certainly showing here because I'm bemoaning the tug of yet another artificial brook trout. The droopy dorsal and mostly faded colors just seem to spit in the face of all the wild populations I'd worked so hard to document up until this point. Fairly skinny and clearly desperate for any flashy scrap of food, I've gotta ask myself, would this fish even be worth keeping for the skillet? When they do eventually open it up to the hordes of folks looking to harvest these holdovers, he might not be anything but skin and bones. Matt and I finished out our short session with a few more bites, but couldn't quite get anything else to stick. Even though we had the evening bite on our side, each pool fished like pressured water. And we could easily see 5 to 10 trout all around the same size in just about every hole. Chances are they'd seen plenty of flies today and over the entirety of their bleak lives as cannon fodder.
Well, for just a couple hours, that was pretty fun.
Before I dive right in, I'd like to be fully transparent here. I'm so far from a classically trained biologist or economist, so anyone not really digging what I'm yapping about over the next few minutes, please feel free to dismiss my silly thesis. In my defense, however, I do like to read, and I've acquired some basic skills in deduction as I've juggled issues like this throughout my life. The more winters I've seen, the more confusing trout management all gets to me. If you'll be so kind as to offer me your ear and an open mind, I'd really like to discuss a few things. The definition of carrying capacity goes as follows: the maximum population size of a species that a particular environment can sustain indefinitely. If we were to go underneath the surface again at Big Snowbird Creek, you can see a mostly empty stream bed. While fishing there, the most I would pull out of any given hole was maybe 2 fish. Granted, there could have been a few more brook trout of various sizes all throughout that just simply didn't bite. My point here is that in one of the healthiest brook trout streams in all of North Carolina, there might have been less than 5 fish, all well under that 12-inch mark. The population of fish adhered to this concept of carrying capacity. Comparing Big Snowbird's best to the similar sized runs at the delayed harvest doppelganger of North Mills, we could easily see 5 to 10 fish of varying species, all well over that 12-inch length distinction in almost every single hole. And that's just what we saw. Who knows how many others were lurking just out of sight. Hopefully you're following along, but to those that are still wondering why this even matters, well, these Southern Appalachian streams have many natural limiting factors leading to the distributions and sizes of fish to be more closely represented by that of wild streams like Big Snowbird. In most of the systems, you can look at things like the general lack of space being one of these massive limiters.
Things got way too narrow, so I guess it's game over for this section.
In general, the water that can support trout tends to be small, fast, and narrow. These high elevation streams couldn't be any different from the stereotypical images that haunt our angling dreams. Quote unquote trout streams in the western United States are a completely different beast. Plain and simple, the little holes that fish can sit in comfortably are few and far between. Well, relatively. Okay, so there's one, but by far the most evident limiting factor that I was able to point my finger at was simply the scarcity of food. When you turn over rocks in these higher elevation systems, there are, well, bugs. Quite a few different species, in fact, there just aren't that many of them. Quantity, yes. Quality, no. Make sense? Even when you bump above the macroinvertebrate level on the food chain, there aren't that many other fish species present. Hell, you'd have a better chance of running into any number of salamander species well before smaller fish. Okay, so why do I bring all this up? Please bear with me. And remember, I'm not a biologist, but my beef with the massive stocking efforts across the region all stem from the concept of carrying capacity. It is my greatly uneducated opinion that dumping in all these stock trout disrupts the carrying capacity and has an adverse effect on the stream ecology as a whole. Be it bugs, native fish, all the salamanders, they're either outcompeted or overpredated due to the imbalance of apex predators. And for what? That's the question I always return to. Unfortunately, and not too dissimilar from many things in life, money is often where this question leads me. There's serious incentive for all the state agencies in the region to sell fishing licenses. While I was witnessing all this, I had the unique opportunity to talk to quite a few individuals on the state level that deal with cold water resource management. Now, I am not at liberty to name names or call out states, but I can specifically remember having hours of quote-unquote off-the-record conversations about the hypocrisy of management practices. Basically, what I gathered is that they have to serve the lowest common denominator in pursuit of selling the maximum number of fishing licenses. Providing opportunities for anglers, no matter how damaging to the overall environment, was by far the highest on their priority list. It was only after hours of back and forth phone conversations did we eventually get to the topic of health and conservation of native fish species, which I have to admit was quite deflating. I can understand where their hands get tied because money makes the world go round. That's just the damn truth. When these agencies don't get properly funded and there's an overwhelming amount of resources to be managed, I can certainly see where other priorities take precedence. Granted, I've heard and read plenty about the economic breakdown of these hatchery systems and what each of these stockfish actually cost the end user. And that's not to mention a limited shelf life once they reach their final destination and the adverse long-term effects on native fish. I mean, I could go on and on because it never really makes sense to me. But this leads to the last issue of this whole stocking and carrying capacity rant, that being the historic nature of it all.
Oh no, it's a little rainbow. Gosh darn it.
When you run across fish like this, objectively, this is a stunning wild rainbow trout. Tough to say where this little guy's ancestors came from. Maybe Northern California, hey, maybe Canada. Hell, he could have some Alaska in him. Again, tough to say, but what I can say is that all this fish has ever known is a Southern Appalachian stream. I'd put good money down to say that this rainbow's lineage, and others like it, have been swimming wild for longer than most of you watching have been alive. Non-native rainbow and brown trout put a crazy amount of pressure on the already stray native brook trout. Filling in a similar niche, these outsiders outcompete and often prey upon juvenile brook trout. So even if stocking efforts have stopped in certain systems, these wild invaders still adhere to this concept of carrying capacity, and because of the general public's general need for something bigger in the skillet or spunkier for the sport, we all now have to lie in this invasive bed that our great-grandparents made for us, the sheets of which continue to encroach upon and suffocate what little airspace is left. It's truly depressing when you pull up a map of the miles and miles of trout streams all across the region that have been invaded by rainbows, browns, and northern strain brook trout, all because of stocking, both current and historic. For the third and final time, I'm not a biologist and I don't control the budgets for these state agencies. At the end of the day, I'm just some dude who, again, knows how to read and likes to fish. I do really hope this doesn't sound too critical, and by no means is this complex issue solved by shutting down all the hatcheries tomorrow. There would need to see a much wider shift in the general angling culture and sentiment of many across the region. I find that raising awareness to all this is the best place to start. I've got high hopes that I'll be able to see a day where quality is held as a higher value over quantity. Wondering what that might actually look like, my mind drifts to a certain national park not too far away that might be able to help paint this picture of a brighter brook trout future. Chapter 3. Specs of the Smoky Mountains. With the average annual visitor rate growing by the year, over 30 million folks set their sights on this massive piece of pristine land split between Tennessee and North Carolina. Sandwiched on either side, Cherokee and Gatlinburg are premier tourist traps, and the traffic emanating from each is enough to make you want to run for the hills.
This is kind of crazy. This is like Estes Park on steroids. It's so big, like way bigger than what I thought it would be.
I can remember wondering if fishing here was maybe going to be a mistake. From the smoke-filled tips hidden in the haze to the greasy grass valleys where the once forgotten herds congregate, this national park is immense and contains many complex layers. With that in mind, I saw it fit to separate this out as its own story. Most come for the chance at seeing the neon array of foliage or the many charismatic park residents. For anglers like myself panning for blue line gems, it's the brook trout fishing that will draw you in and keep you hunting for that sound of water.
Okay, here we are. In total, the park encompasses just around 800 square miles of prime temperate and subtropical deciduous forest. Hidden amongst the leaf litter and moss-covered boulders, this dark earth is a hotbed for biodiversity. One could spend a lifetime tracking down the thousands of crawling, swimming, and flying species strewn across this increasingly rare environment. With the many miles of streams meandering from the tip-tops of the mountains down to the sprawling floodplains, you may recognize such names as the Raven and Roaring Fork, Hazel and Cosby Creek, as well as the Little Tennessee and Oconalufty River. Out of all this water, wild brook trout have managed to hold out in around 150 miles of the available 800 flowing within the park. Not too dissimilar from other streams seen up until this point, a lot of the thriving populations have been forced to the higher elevations due to many interconnecting issues.
The Great Smoky Mountain National Park has been high on my bucket list of angling destinations for many years now. Through both videos and books, my imagination had conjured up an image of moss-covered cascades brimming to the top with whispers of both orange and green. My mind had somehow manifested this dream and, with such vivid strokes, had painted its way into my reality. Being 10 toes down in this frigid mountain water, it almost seems hard to believe, and holding each one of these unique Southern Appalachian brook trout fulfilled a tightly held promise made to a much younger version of who I once was.
Yeehaw! Yeah, mama! Woo-hoo-hoo! That's a great one.
My first taste of Great Smoky Gold was admittedly short, but boy howdy, it was certainly sweet. This burning-bellied squaretail was the canary in the coal mine for the entirety of this next chapter. I had my eye set on some bigger systems in both North Carolina and Tennessee. These streams were far more remote than where I was today and could offer a true backcountry experience. I suppose time would only tell the result, but I was ready to attack this puzzle head-on and uncover more of the mysteries of this incredible national park.
Hey, bear. Well, it sounds like the birds are finally starting to wake up, which is nice. I just saw a bear. There he is, there he is, there he is. That right there, hard to see. That's my first Smokies black bear. Hey, bear! Get on out of here. I'm gonna take the opportunity now to change into my wading boots, get out of the hiking boots, so that I can just jump right onto the water, if need be.
Between the drive-in and hike thus far, I'd already been awake for quite some time. That bear, he managed to get my blood pumping a bit faster, so I was now more than wide awake. But deep in my heart, I somehow still felt a little bit behind. Being that this was a weekend in the park and the purple of dawn was burning off fast, I had every expectation that there would be a few folks already camped out and potentially starting their day of fishing soon. Wanting to separate myself as best as possible, I made a, hasty decision to cut straight for the river rather than following the trail where it passes by the campground. Trying to off-trail traverse this nearly impenetrable environment was an incredibly stupid idea. There were more than a few times where I was convinced the search and rescue team would need a helicopter and a roto-rooter to rip my stiff corpse out of this suffocating hellhole. One bad slip or turn of the knee and I was good as toast. But by the grace of the old mountains, I saw a gap in the trees. Like a cold glass of water on a scorching hot summer day, the first unencumbered breath was deep and very satisfying. The free air carried by the breeze filled my lungs with the sweet scent of this famous fork, and it put my mind at ease. I think the Raven was going to be mine for the day.
Good. Okay. I think I've done enough walking. It's time to fish.
In any book or website article, the running claim was that this was unequivocally the best brook trout stream within the park. Watch any YouTube video, or hell, just hear it firsthand from any dedicated blue liner, the sentiment holds true. The Upper Raven Fork is the place you want to be if you're hunting for that 12-inch Southern Appalachian brook trout. Well, allegedly. Now, outside of just the fishing, there are quite a few other reasons as to why I was encouraged to find this fork. But I was warned, it'd come with a price. Trying to blaze a path all on my own was nearly impossible. I can't emphasize that enough. This terrain would be sure to give anyone, no matter how well equipped, a damn tricky time. So looking back, it makes sense as to why this drainage was mostly spared by logging companies prior to the establishment of the national park. Back when industry was stripping resources from this region, it seems odd that they didn't or couldn't successfully make their way up to this upper watershed. Just for the spectacle alone, where I was waiting is seen as a unique environment amongst unique environments. These old growth groves are more than few and far between in today's day and age. Rare is an adequate word to describe them. Due to that, everything else around the river felt so different to what I'd experienced prior in this trip. The trunks of some of these trees had been standing tall since feudalism dominated European society, or as the Mongol horde kept its stranglehold on most of Asia, and even as the Incan Empire was starting to see its rise to power. This surrounding timber has stood through it all. Hundreds of years worth of history is hard for our puny brains to put into perspective, and it never fails to make my head spin. This was an old forest. Bringing things back streamside, I couldn't help but feel that the fishing so far could be best described as, well, fair to Midland. Now don't get me wrong, the quantity of fish was most certainly present. After that first domino fell, the others quickly followed. I may have let other anglers' accounts influence my now lofty expectations, but for some reason, I was hoping for a bit more. This river was so impressive in both size and flow, but I had to remember this was still a high elevation system. Food must be scarce, but with so much ideal holding water, I held faith and kept casting for that upper tier brook trout. Hey, maybe the big fish were just being a bit sluggish. Recalling back to places like Big Snowbird, the action really didn't get started until early afternoon when terrestrial insects began to move with the warmth of the day. The weather certainly wasn't in my corner, seeing as it was going to be mostly cold and overcast for the foreseeable future. Overall, it's hard to tell what the issue might be, but what I did notice is that the river was quickly changing from big waterfall pools to now very turbid and narrow plunges. Maybe the bigger fish were holding here.
Darling, please forgive me if I stare a little more. I can't look away from those brown eyes. And if we settle down, we don't have to settle down. We Please don't be afraid of all the things that could go wrong. We can take our time and we may change our mind. But I can tell a good thing when a good thing comes along. Darling, tell me all about the dreams you had last night. You can be so restless in your sleep. I ain't going nowhere, all this feels so very right. When you find good love, it's the one that you should keep. And if we settle down, we don't have to settle down. Please don't be afraid of all the things that could go wrong. That we can take our time and we may change our mind. But I can tell a good thing when a good thing comes along. If I ever hurt you, dear, oh, I apologize. Heaven knows I'm no perfect man. I can't take another night without you by my side. Please come home as quickly as you can. And if we settle down, we don't have to settle down. Please don't be afraid of all the things that could go wrong. We could take our time, we may change our mind. But I can tell a good thing when a good thing comes along.
Maneuvering up and over the infinity staircase of rapids was far from easy and hell on the knees. If it weren't for the predictable placement of brook trout along the way, I could see this being a laborious day in some folks' books. I will say, the scale of the corridor allowed for a comfortable amount of airspace both above and behind for cathartic casting with long drawn-out loops. Like I tend to do, I made the effort to carry 2 rods. The always and ever-present adjustable dry dropper rod and a solo dry fly rod were my adventure partners for the day. Looking back, there was no real need for a third wheel, seeing as the fish were almost exclusively surface oriented. I can barely remember one, if any, caught using that subsurface presentation. Their affinity for a dainty dry fly dancing on the surface reminds me so much of cutthroat trout behavior out west. And, like I've harped on quite a bit, their watery home doesn't have all that much to offer in the way of fish food. So I'm certain they depend on the surrounding old growth to provide them with terrestrial insects to reliably feed on during the warmer months. So far, my sloppy dry fly casting had been more than enough to punish the small to mid-tier fish in the system. Lulled into ginger hook sets with my stiffer 5-weight, this next fish came as quite a surprise. I was almost certain I had managed to do it. Surely this was the raven fork fish I'd been dreaming of.
Oh, it's a rainbow. It's a good fish, shit.
The disappointment in my voice might rub some the wrong way, but witnessing the steady creep of non-native trout into these supposedly safe strongholds, it's tough. This wasn't the only rainbow I found within the park either. With a much broader habitat tolerance towards silt and pollution, rainbows have a higher fecundity and growth rate when compared to brookies. Even though the rainbows are spring spawners, once their eggs hatch, they will often outcompete the crop of brook trout that were reared in the previous fall. So just give any watershed time, and these rainbows tend to win out. Now in both situations, I was targeting brook trout with no intention to harvest. On top of that, with a slot limit of 7 inches in the park, it didn't even cross my mind as something I ought to do. So really, I had no good way to take these non-native fish out of the system, and I didn't want to kill a wild fish just to kill it. So admittedly, putting them both back felt a little conflicting. The best I can do is offer up this information and allow you, the viewer, to do with what you please. The number of fish on the day had certainly reached a point of satisfaction, and even though the surroundings didn't show, the neutral light was reaching well past mid-afternoon. The clock was ticking, and I only had time for a few more fish, one of which happened to be my favorite of the day. As this brook trout journey continues, I'm becoming more and more fond of the random orange blotches that break up the vermiculated dorsal fins on certain specimens. I should say, all these fish were beautiful in their own right, but this speck in particular was just a bit brighter than the rest. Easy on the eyes, this fish made all the toil worth it. Worth the strained muscles, worth the aching bones, and very much worth the sting of cold water. Well, until next time, friend. Earlier in the day, I'd fallen pretty hard on my left knee, and after a whole day's worth of twisting and turning through the slippery stream bed, radiating pain was growing too loud to ignore over the sound of rushing water. Realistically, I didn't have energy for more casting, and time was no longer on my side. Like many trips before, my eyes had been much bigger than my stomach. Piss and vinegar from the morning's fervor had me convinced that the confluence pool would be my natural stopping point, but I was nowhere even close to that. I learned the hard lesson that one day just might not be enough to fully explore and experience the beauty of this upper valley. This chubby munching brook trout would unfortunately have to be my last. For a parting gift from this old growth fortress, I couldn't complain all that much. But with that being said, I might have a few choice words for the series of slippery waterfalls in my future. Going up was easy enough. Sliding down, well, that almost resulted in disaster. But that story, it might be left for another day. Oh, and I'm sure glad I brought my bear spray with me on this one. It looks like my friend from earlier, he got a little grumpy. So much so, in fact, they actually closed down the trail behind me. All in all, this was an incredible day and truly a beautiful backcountry experience out east. Pressured from behind by the glaring taillights of the many other ravenous park goers, I found myself on the Tennessee side this time around. The books I read, they weren't kidding. Things felt considerably more crowded.
Want to get our picture? I see you're a photographer.
Do you want me to take a picture, you guys? Is that what you're asking?
I'm kidding you. Like, you wanted to get our picture.
Yes, here's my, will you take a picture of us?
Yeah, of course. I'm so confused right now, yeah.
Now, that could be my own fault, because here I was again on yet another weekend, parked parallel to one of the park's many famous trails. Desperate to avoid the crowds congregating in the lot, I buckled down and used my young legs to create distance. Gaining elevation with each step, the clouds hanging in the treetops seemed to be falling all around me like a slow but steady elevator ride. The humidity was so thick and heavy, it physically felt like I was walking through flowing linens hung to air dry along the trail. Unaccompanied by flashes or claps, the first heavy drop made an audible splat as it fell on the brim of my cap. With each step up the path, the cold rain hitting my hot skin grew slowly at first. Clearly, rain was inevitable, but I wasn't ready to witness the true power these clouds had been hiding this whole time.
Man, it's really starting to rain now. Oh. Whew. It's really raining now. Guess it's just gonna be one of those days. Hopefully the fish don't mind. Let's get you out. Well, and just like that, the rain subsided, and here we are.
Feeling like a cat in the rain, I was thoroughly soaked from head to toe before I ever set foot in the water. But here I was, the mighty Lynn Camp Prom. On a more granular level, I'm sure there are quite a few things that she shares with her raven sister over the ridge. But outside of hosting a robust brook trout population, I really didn't see all that much to compare this and the Upper Ravens Fork. The first and by far the most important differentiating detail worth noting is the elevation. On the Raven, I started my day around that 3,000 foot mark and climbed all the way to 4. The general rule of thumb in this part of the world is to not start looking for brook trout until you hit that 3,000 mark. That's the reason I chose to pursue a different stream today. Hovering right around the mid 2000s, I was much lower in elevation by comparison. Now you could most certainly push further up into the higher reaches of this well-publicized prong, but that wasn't the point. Low and mid-elevation brook trout streams all across Appalachia, and especially in the national park, are extremely rare. In most cases, browns and rainbows dominate these portions of the watersheds, and the further down you go, you'll start seeing smallmouth. The rain had softened the color of the deep green water, and out of the dancing riffles came the first flash of orange cutting through the fog. Wow. For a first fish, this was a speckled up spectacle. Overpronounced parr markings were so well defined and gave this fish a different look. Almost overshadowed, but caught right at the last second, was the vermiculate patterns on the back bleeding further down into the tail fin. This was a fine way to shake off the skunk.
All right, we are in business here, and I put on a, I guess you could call that like a pink tan leech. This looks like either a worm or potentially a salamander getting washed into the water here. So we'll see how aggressive these fish are and if they want to eat something bigger with the influx of this rain here this morning. All right, made it back to the trail. I'm gonna do that again. I'm gonna walk down, find another section that's kind of away from the trail, dip in, fish it up, and yeah, maybe catch a few more at least.
Inclement weather and high-holing anglers had certainly slowed me down, so I admittedly didn't really crack down on the stream as well as I would have liked. This would be my last visit to the park, and with the fishing proving to be this good, I would have killed to have an extra day on this system. Now, taking a brief snapshot of this little instant in time doesn't really paint a great picture, because not too long ago, the brook trout fishing would have been non-existent here. Circa 2008, non-native rainbows were dominating the majority of this stream above the many natural cascades along the trail. There was an extensive push by the park to remove these fish and return this productive mid-elevation stream back to the native brook trout. It took many years and countless man-hours to see it to its fruition, and for a long time, it was closed to us anglers. Personally, I'm ecstatic that they've been able to open it back up to the general public in the last decade or so. Sure makes for easy access to some of the best brook trout fishing in the region. I really can't understate the importance of this stream and the success of this restoration. Sure, there have been other places within the borders that have been given back to the natives, but not to the same degree with both scale and significance. This project allowed the many high elevation tributaries to finally be reconnected to the lower elevation main body of the system. And as my day was reaching its end, I really want to stop for a second and talk about the very relevant concept of connectivity. Now, it's no secret that a 12-inch trout doesn't really provoke the fanfare of many fly anglers across this pale blue dot. Like I've said time and time again, finding a Southern Appalachian brook trout anywhere close to that 12-inch mark is nothing short of a real angling accomplishment. You blue liners out there, you gotta have my back on that. I'm sure you're sitting there asking yourself at this point, why does Mike keep bringing this up? Well, it's because these Southern Appalachian fish could get a lot bigger if there was better connectivity within the watersheds they live. Now, hold your horses. I'm not saying these humble char will be able to balloon to the proportions of places like Labrador, but hear me out. On the larger end of this spectrum, you could point at something to the scale of a hydroelectric dam and the massive reservoirs they tend to leave in their wake. Controlled by the power company, and now with recreation and real estate interests involved too, I don't foresee a day where these get taken off the land. It's sad, and we're kind of stuck with them. On the smaller scale, something as simple as a culvert used to reroute water can be just as detrimental in cutting off populations of fish from one another. Throughout this journey, I also found barriers installed by desperate state agencies in an attempt to disrupt the ever-encroaching invasion of non-native fish like this wild rainbow trout. My point here is that all these barriers, no matter what their original purpose was meant to be, disrupt the various life histories these fish could display. For the vast majority of the Southern Appalachian brook trout, they only have access to habitat that allows them to display the stream resident life history. This means they hatch, grow, spawn, and die in the very narrow confines of the stream in which they were reared. We're talking miles, 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 if they're lucky, but they don't have that much room to grow. On top of that, statistically, each individual is supposed to have an almost 60% mortality rate once they reach adulthood. Just due to predation, competition, and natural disasters like flash floods, these brook trout in the higher elevations have a very heavy turnover. These pressured environmental factors don't really give an individual a whole lot of opportunity to track down big meals or the time needed to grow past that 12-inch range. I made it a point to step foot into some of the lower elevation streams in the region, and do you know what I found? Food. I found lots of fish food. Between minnows, dace, chubs, darters, and sculpins, the further down you go, the more you're gonna find. That's not to mention crayfish, hellgrammites, frogs, and even mice all throughout. Going up yet another level, I went back and read some old records of such thick runs of spawning suckerfish from Georgia to Virginia, they would sometimes be compared to the Pacific salmon runs west of the Rockies. But even many of those once prolific spawning runs have been disrupted by fractured systems.
Most of the emphasis so far has really been focused on the brook trout, and that's the goal of this video, is to talk about them, but you can't tell their story without talking about some of the other fish in these systems. And it kind of goes back to this point of connectivity. It's a big issue, be it in the east or in the west, but it affects all these native fish, especially our brook trout. But one of the things about these streams is that there are so many different species of non-game fish. So your sticklebacks, your darters, your mad toms, any number of little catfish and other minnow species like that are present in these systems. And you'll have bigger ones even, like your suckers and some bass species. And those bigger fish, they bring nutrients, much like your salmon, in a fully intact system. They'll go out into the bigger water, come up to spawn smaller water, but that doesn't really happen a whole lot. Now, there are some cool projects going on where be it dam removals or impoundments getting taken out to help have that more connective system, but it's a slow uphill battle. I guess my point in saying all this and showing all these non-game native fish species is that these are the puzzle pieces, these are the items needed to make bigger fish. So in a lot of these brook trout streams, 12 inches is going to be the top tier. That's going to be the best most of these blue liners do out here. That is for wild native fish. Stockfish, you can catch some big fish, but these smaller fish, you know, just like any other food chain, you know, you build up, you build up, you build up. The more of these small fish that you have in a system, you know, the more forage a fish has, and the less likely it's going to be to starve. Because, you know, a lot of these streams out here, like you've maybe seen already, are pretty barren. There's not a lot of biomass available to grow big fish. That's why out west you have these just bug factories producing large numbers and sizes of fish. But out here, you know, you might have 1 or 2 wild native brook trout to a hole, and they don't have much in the way of food. That's why they're so dependent on what comes into the water from terrestrial sources, and that's why, you know, the dry fly fishing out here is really great. But I don't know, I dream of a day, after getting to experience all these different streams, I really do, I dream of a day where these systems get connected and more of these forage fish that are kind of coming from some of the lower elevation parts of these streams can be reconnected, and those brook trout can have a more fluvial life pattern, go from their, you know, high up spawning grounds back into some more nutrient rich, biomass rich environments, and get bigger. But that's probably far down the road, but who knows, you know, a lot can change in a little bit of time.
Be it red horse sucker eggs in the spring, sipping cicadas in the summer, hunting mice in the fall, or sucking down sculpin all winter long, imagine how much more food these fish would be able to access if they can move freely throughout interconnected systems. I really hope you're understanding what I'm trying to say here. Brook trout have lost access to more than 75% of these low to mid-tier elevation streams all throughout their native range. I mean, that number alone kind of makes my mind spin. The more systems that could be restored and reconnected, the better chance we would all have to see bigger fish living out a more fluvial life stage. Affording the opportunity for fish to move out of the higher elevations and down into the big water would be extremely interesting to see. Unencumbered by fractured habitat, I truly believe these brook trout could live longer and outgrow that 12-inch mark. I couldn't help but optimistically daydream of a world where my grandkids could maybe go chase fluvial Southern Appalachian brook trout way down in the big water. For now, I suppose the beautiful brook trout of the Lynn Camp Prong will have to be the model for future success. In a flash of orange, my last great smoky fish snapped me out of this hopeful trance, and it was time to go. Funny enough, on my way back, I had a group of hikers stop me and ask me what kind of fish was swimming down in that stream. Was it largemouth bass? I have to admit this was pretty funny, and I asked them if they'd ever heard of brook trout. They were mostly unfamiliar, and I kind of wish I could have introduced them to my new friend, because he knows a great deal about these little fish. After many months of correspondence back and forth and filming permits pushed through right in the nick of time, I was so excited for this interview. Seeing as this was quite a unique opportunity, I figured I'd start things out fairly simple. I wanted to know if he remembered his first brook trout.
Yeah, I do remember my first brook trout. I was fishing with my dad. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and we were fishing a stream at a gun club that he was a member of. That's where I learned to do a lot of fishing and shooting, and we usually caught rainbow trout. And so I hooked this fish that I knew was different. And as I brought it up, first I noticed the color of the fins was different. But what really struck me was when I put my hand on that fish, just to feel the feel of a char is different. And I picked that brook trout up, and my dad was like, wow, you caught a brook trout. So that was really my first introduction to this different trout, so to speak, that I'd never seen before. I was probably about 6 years old.
That's awesome.
So it was pretty cool.
So if that was your first brook trout, can you talk to me about your first Southern Appalachian brook trout?
Yeah, man, what a dichotomy. I mean, when I first came to the Smoky Mountains and I started working here, we got to go out and do some electrofishing on a stream, and I believe it was over in Indian Camp Creek, which is over in the Cott County portion of the park. And we got rolled in there, and we're doing this site, and we rolled up this fish, and I remember just being stunned by the look at this fish. I mean, it didn't look real. The big red spots, the big bright orange and reddish fins with the black and white trim on those, and I couldn't believe it was a brook trout. I was like, this doesn't even look like the fish that I grew up fishing for when I was a kid, the stockers. And so just fell in love with that fish right away. Just the beauty of it, and just being amazed at something like that living in these mountains was pretty cool.
That's awesome.
After everything I'd seen and read up until this point, the most pressing question on my mind was whether or not these fish were in serious trouble.
Are brook trout in trouble? That's a good question, in the sense that I think it depends where you're at. In the southeast, at least here in the Smokies, I think our brook trout were in trouble for a number of decades. And the reason was they were being pinched from the bottom by encroachment of rainbow trout. We had really big problems with acid deposition and acid rain, which was squeezing them from the top. The good news there is that recently acid rain has become much better, to the point where our water, our pH of the rain coming in is doing tremendously better than it did 40 years ago. The issue is it's going to take a long time for those soils that feed our streams and buffer that material to become healthy. So one other piece of that question, you know, as far as the future of brook trout that I think is important is climate. And I think one of the big things that benefit brook trout where they live is the influence of groundwater. And what we see is our groundwater resources are pretty stable. In fact, you know, warmer and wetter as they project wouldn't be all bad for brook trout because the groundwater influence is going to be there. The question mark becomes when that climate, you know, continues to get worse, continues to increase, what is the resiliency of our groundwater resources? And that's a question we just don't know. And so I think in the short term they have some buffering versus some other species. The question is the long term in terms of climate and how that's going to affect those populations up high.
With that in mind, I was curious as to what conservation efforts we're doing right when trying to restore brook trout.
I think right now is a really cool time for conservation of brook trout because for many years the park was one of the leaders in restoring native brook trout species across the range, both with electrofishing and toxicants. And what's happened in probably the last 2-3 years is in states like Tennessee, North Carolina are really jumping in. Tennessee's been doing it probably for more like 5 or 10 years. North Carolina's got a whole slew of streams that they're predicting to restore over the next 5 to 10 years. And so all that is adding more range back into the distribution of these fish in the southeast. Georgia is getting ready to do some. South Carolina's done at least 4. You start adding those states up and the mileages, it's a pretty exciting time really for brook trout restoration and putting fish back on the landscape. And as these streams recover from acidification, we can just keep adding to that list. And so I think that's one thing the states and the federal government agencies are doing right now.
Naturally, I was also interested in what the biggest bottlenecks to helping these fish might be.
I guess I would look at about 3 or 4 different big bottlenecks in the world of brook trout. One would be habitat protection. If you look across the range, the Smokies, we're in the forever business, so the habitat's forever protected. Well, once you get out of the Smokies, this place has turned into an island because you have development, headwater development in a lot of places in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina. So that's a big bottleneck problem going forward, protecting their habitat. Number 2, I would say soil recovery. No matter where they're at, the entire southeast has been, as we said, hammered by nitrogen sulfur from emissions. And so it's going to take some time for that to get cleaned up and to move its way out of the system and recover, get those soil pHs and stream pHs back up. And I think the other big bottleneck that I see in the future that we have to be concerned about, and every one of us can help with this, is keeping these brook trout and where they live relevant. These are special places. If we start losing the relevancy with our younger generations, then they don't have a reason to keep protecting them. Take your kids out, show them these places, get out there and fish for these things where they're at. It's an awesome place, and it's good for the soul to be out there and check them out.
As far as end goal, what do you want to see with all this conservation work? Like in a 20, 40, 60 year period down the road, when we're all long and gone, what do you hope to see be the result of all this work?
I guess my goal with all this work would be, we know the climate is always, temperature's always increasing and has always decreased over time. And so hopefully there's enough protected places that we've restored brook trout, or at least protect brook trout, that they can survive these periods of warming and development and land encroachment, such that we can preserve enough the genetics and enough populations to sustain them for the next generations to come. And that's I think the goal for all of us, for a lot of species we all work with.
This may seem like a lofty end goal to some, but Rome wasn't built in a day. I saved this last question for this exact reason. I wanted to know what folks out there could do to help the Southern Appalachian brook trout.
Well, there's a lot of different answers to that question. So I guess I would start off with, first of all, understanding where these fish live and educating yourself on that. What's cool about where brook trout live is there's so many other things that people would love to see. You might find a red-cheeked salamander, or a shovel-nosed salamander, or a black-bellied salamander. You might see rock gnome lichen, which is a rare plant. You might just like to sit there and watch the waterfalls and cascades where they live. It's just an awesome place, and they're worth protecting. And I think once you kind of get a grasp of that and see it, it kind of gets in your blood. It kind of gets in your soul that this is something worth protecting, worth saving. and then figuring out how we can do that. There's a lot of conservation organizations out there that are helping us do that.
Matt mentioned that organizations like the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Trout Unlimited, and the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture are all able to offer help in their own way.
And then there's opportunities to get involved with volunteering. The Park Service is one. The state agencies in many cases will have opportunities for you to come out, whether they're doing a population sample, just to keep a pulse on how those populations are doing, maybe to collect some fin clips for genetics testing, or maybe to do an actual restoration on the stream to remove non-natives and put native brook trout or specks back in. I mean, those are all great ways to come and get involved if you have an opportunity, and to connect with that resource as well. And finally, I guess I would say, for people that live far away, maybe not just another state, maybe another country, all the things I mentioned, many of them would work for you, but in other ways, it may be, making that connection with that place to a place there where you live. And, maybe you can do a restoration or have a similar type of experience in your homeland, and, take that opportunity at some point to come to the States and see where these brook trout live and what makes them special here as well.
I'd hate to sound like a broken record here, but I cannot emphasize how amazing of an opportunity it was interviewing Matt Culp. His knowledge base alone was so impressive, and I really think we could have sat there all day long talking brook trout. Before we leave the national park, I'd like to stop again for just a bit and further the conversation on how you, the viewer at home, can help these fish. Okie doke. I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to put this in the video. I don't like these big pauses in the storyline, but this is the best spot for it. But before I even started filming, before I even started doing research, this was something I wanted to have within this particular video. I wanted to make something a little bit more fish focused rather than just Mike and friends going out and having fun. I wanted it to be something bigger than itself, have some sort of conservation element to it. And I want to talk about that a little bit more right now, because maybe it's clear to see through the video as I've been kind of narrating along, but the host of issues that are plaguing the Southern Appalachian brook trout and others in its native range here in the east, the list is long, and it's all intertwined. It's not as simple as a series of dams on the Snake River, or something as sexy as maybe like the Pebble Mine and a big issue that everybody can get behind and sign a petition and block that, and you damn industry people. It's not as simple as that. It's so many intertwined issues, and that comes from the environmental side, that comes from the social side, the people involved and the people's wants and needs, and like land encroachment. Loss of habitat is such an issue out here, but it's tough because there is a lot of private land, and the public land that is here, it's slowly getting encroached on, and water quality is an issue. Acid rain was a big issue. There's various studies about the changes in temperature and climate and how it fluctuates, and this all goes into the picture of the brook trout that are here, and the possibility of brook trout tomorrow. So I worked with the national park, so the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. I was very lucky to interview the lead biologist, fisheries biologist, I should say. Matt Culp is an amazing dude, and he's really doing some amazing stuff for the park, and then it reverberates out to other parts of the native range. But fly season and our various partners, we have a little bit of expendable cash. The YouTube money. It's a neat thing, and for this one, I wanted to maybe, instead of putting that towards the next trip or the next camera, put it towards conservation. And so Flow Season and our partners, we've put together a lump sum, I would say a pretty sizable one, and we're going to be donating it directly to the national park. Now, this fund that they have goes directly to brook trout. The most streamlined way is through the donation tab on the Friends of the Smokies homepage. Select the Make a Gift option and fill out your own personal information, but the major key here is when you get towards the bottom. Mention in the comments section that you would like these funds to go towards brook trout restoration. I've been assured that no matter how far down the road you're seeing this video, specifically stating your donations are meant for brook trout restoration is a surefire way of getting these funds to where they need to go. This was by far the most effective option, and in the end, it is extremely appreciated.
They use this money to hire on fisheries technicians for the summertime, usually interns from college. And so, yeah, not only are you helping because they're helping, but then you're also, giving a kid a really awesome opportunity to do something that they love and yeah, get their feet dirty and, yeah, get their hands dirty, get their feet wet, in a really cool environment. And so I'm not saying that you have to donate. That's the last thing I want to say, because everybody's financial situation is different, and yeah, times are tough. I understand. And so I just want to put that out there and say that there is a way, for those of you who are in the West or in the North or in the South, or maybe even not in the same country. Maybe some of you are learning about these fish for the first time. And so being able to sign up for volunteer opportunities, being in touch with the local Native Fish Coalition chapters or Trout Unlimited chapters, like, you cannot be there for cleanups or restorations and be a part of decision making. It's not feasible. But what you can do, sitting on your couch watching this video, is you can get on your phone, because everybody's just probably just sitting right here, and you can go donate to a really awesome thing like the national park. And again, specifically, this channel is for the fisheries and the brook trout. And so, yeah, I mean, talking with Matt and getting to get a better understanding of the ins and outs of the park and again, how that money tangibly affects the fish. And I personally got to experience it. And so I think it's a really awesome cause. And if you have the means, I would highly recommend doing it, and then, yeah, seeing the effects of your donations. So yeah, come give the park a visit. But I don't need to tell you that their tourism board's doing just fine. But yeah, I wanted to stop and offer that, because I think it's important. And I guess as I've got a platform that's raising, and as fly season continues to grow, I do want to do more stuff like this. This is hopefully the first of many. So thank you if you are generous enough to offer a bit of your valuable income. And yeah, let's get back to the video and finish this thing out.
Chapter 4. Volunteers and Vermiculation. The longitudinal stretch of a state like Tennessee means it sees a fair bit of environmental variation from east to west. With Memphis on the Mississippi and Nashville in the plains, association to mountains might be on the low side of the list for most folks when they think of the volunteer state. The lingering burn from hot chicken or the sour smell of fermented corn can all be accompanied by the sound of country music. From pyramid shrines celebrating the world of bass fishing to the oddities of Dollywood or Graceland dotted throughout, this state boasts a few tourist-worthy attractions. But with major cities like Knoxville and Chattanooga sitting right on the shelf of the eastern slope of the Appalachians, there are just under 1,000 miles of fishable trout waters not too far from civilization. The South Holston, Clinch, and Elk Rivers are some of the most well-known and have a tendency to produce some rather healthy fish. Out of all the waters, it's estimated the native brook trout are present in about 20 to 30% of the remaining cold water systems. After the most recent surveys, it's claimed that there are around 100 confirmed populations left within the state.
He smashed it! Oh, he smashed it!
That's out.
Oh, no way. They're getting smaller, bro. They're getting smaller. Oh. Did you see that? Oh, yes! Keep him on, that was so incredible. Wow, yeah, he did. Good God. Where are you going with that, Mr. Man?
Definitely walk directly in front of the camera.
What little time I did find myself within these borders will be spent in the upper reaches of the Great Valley and the Untangle mountain range. The relic populations are there, it just might take a bit of extra work to hunt them down. Spring was on full display at this point in the trip, and I found myself at a mostly empty parking lot. The signs all around informed us that this was quite the slice of Southern Appalachian highlands. Mostly forgotten by development, this impressive preserve gave a great look at what this region used to look like. Joined by my new friend Aaron, we pointed our boots toward the clouds and started our hike in.
He's like the guy that runs their marketing department. Hey, bud. What's up?
They sure are making this a labyrinth. Jesus Christ.
Yeah. It's kind of cool that they they recognize the brook need to be protected though. And
Yeah.
Through the dense underbrush, we could hear the sound of the barrier falls screaming against the morning bird calls. That was our reference point on where we should start focusing our fishy efforts. Southampton is a well-documented creek that is supposed to boast one of the more impressive brook trout populations in Tennessee. Granted, our first few attempts made it seem like this little trickle might be all but empty. We both thought we might have snuck a glance of a darting shadow, but uncertainty remained. Luckily, before we got too down on our efforts, Aaron broke the skunk with a lovely pocket water specimen. And an impressive impromptu net job, I might add. After his fish slipped back, my first fish followed not soon after. Throughout this entire trip, and especially today, I found myself extremely distracted by all the critters that skitter alongside a healthy brook trout stream like this. It was technically mission accomplished, and the sheer amount of salamanders was like nothing I'd ever seen, so my attention wandered just a bit. While I was distracted, Aaron kept his focus on the fishing, and we got back to the task at hand. Even though I brought my normal 2-rod setup, we were both finding plenty of success on a well-placed dry fly. Nothing specific and nothing special, just some very general stimulator patterns were enough to move these brookies toward action. This was far from an isolated instance, and it could be argued that this little pattern caught the majority of the fish throughout this trip. I figured it might be worth stopping the action for just a bit and explaining how I whip up this bug. Can't say I ever give my flies any sort of real name, I leave that stuff for the dorks. For this video, let's just call it the synthetic stimmy. Simply put, it's just a play on the classic and always effective stimulator. Before getting started, I want to make a note of how small this hook is. I had a few bigger versions of this fly that didn't seem to work near as well. Be it the hook gap or attack point, a lot of the smaller fish never connected, so I had to dial it in and downsize just a bit. But regardless, starting things off, I'm gonna grab a healthy pinch of Crystal Flash. That will make up the majority of the tail, and once I trim that flush to my desired length, I'm gonna grab one of the only organic materials throughout this entire recipe, that being some basic hackle. But once it's all locked in, I'm gonna take a real skinny pinch of some synthetic dry fly dubbing, and when I say thin, folks, I mean thin. Trust me, you can always add more if your stimmy isn't quite stacking up to your curvy requirements. My body is just about there. Now I can do some forward wraps with that hackle I locked in earlier, and yeah, try your best to keep it even, but it doesn't have to be any sort of precision there, and Yes, I know, the sizing, it's not perfect, but I promise you the fish don't give a rat's ass. Plus, I'll trim a lot of that flesh later on, so in the end, it doesn't really matter. Cool, now time for the wing, and I can't emphasize this enough. This right here is a very simple pattern. I'm tossing on a pinch of poly yarn, and that's about it for the wing. Be it for chubbies or parachute posts, this is a material that I trust to keep my fly above the water, and it hasn't let me down yet. Now, working on the head, the process of the body, it's just gonna get repeated. Tie in that hackle, pinch that dubbing thin, and wrap both forward to the eye of the hook. The only difference this time around would be the addition of rubber legs on either side. This can make the final wraps with both the dubbing and the hackle a touch more frustrating, but I promise you these legs will be worth the extra effort. Once everything gets its final adjusting, whip finish, and trimming, this synthetic Frankenstein is ready for a sweet smooch from any self-respecting speckled trout.
Now, when it comes to fly fishing out here, you can have any number of techniques that you find to be effective, but I found that their attention seems to be towards the surface. And if you turn over some rocks, you do a little hypothesis, you'll find that there's not a lot of food within these systems, especially the higher up you go, the higher elevation streams. There's a large diversity of bugs, but there's not a large quantity of bugs in most cases. So that's why I found to have the most luck on dry flies. And this specific dry fly is a bit of a bastardization of a very classic fly that a lot of people like to use out here. But this is what I'm calling the synthetic stimulator. It's big, it's buggy, it loves to float, and these fish really like it. And I am kind of in the camp, I don't like specifics. I think people get too bogged down in the details and they say, oh, well, I need to have 3 fibers here, or this specific color there. And maybe in certain situations, in certain waters, but especially in these mountain streams, general patterns are going to serve you very well. And the stimulator, can resemble any number of critters. A cricket jumps in, maybe it's a frog, maybe it's a beetle, maybe it's a stonefly. There's yellow sallies going everywhere, bigger stoneflies too. It could be a caddis, a mayfly, it could be anything. And when presented properly, the fish don't have that much time to look at it and react, so they see it and usually they just grab it. Now, what I will say is that this synthetic model, I find it does a little bit better job of floating, and it's a bit more receptive to some floatants. And yeah, I don't know, I just tied with what I had in the box. That's, again, what I do isn't all that complicated, it's just effective for me. Now, what I will say is that I had tied a couple different versions of this fly, kind of in some bigger sizes, because I'm used to fishing out west. I'm used to big bugs and big fish going for them. And what I found, a lot of times these fish would either struggle to get the whole fly, or they would kind of drown it, and then somewhere in that whole hook set interaction I would miss them. So I did have to size down with this particular bug, but since doing that, it's been really effective, and the fish, they don't seem to mind. So hopefully this helps build some context. I like to show the flies that I'm using, and more specifically how I like to tie them, because when you're getting flies at fly shops, no offense to them, it's just, you don't know what the quality rating of that is going to be, and I'm more partial to my own quality control and trusting the things that I tie. So if they break or if they start to come unraveled, I'm the one to blame, not some poor fly shop. So yeah, folks, that is about enough of that. Hopefully this helps, and yeah, hopefully you can tie up the synthetic stimmy and catch some of these native brookies yourself. Thank you. There's one of them in there. Even after dozens of brook trout seen over a wide geographic range, I am still awestruck with the unique patterns and the vibrant colors each one of these fish can display. Small in stature, but all its physical features were turned up to 11. I wouldn't want to sit here and choose any favorites, but I would put a heavy wager down that the neon memory of this fish
will be stuck in my mind for quite some time. Now, as he slid back, it must be mentioned that this morning was never meant to be an all-day excursion. We both had things to attend to later on in the day. Regardless, getting out and chasing a few Tennessee natives was made well worth it, especially with a new friend. But like I'd mentioned, this is a state I didn't give nearly enough attention. I'm ashamed to say the small number of specimens seen throughout this outing is all I really have to show. My calendar, it can be mostly unforgiving, and this trip was moving well into the fourth quarter. With 4 out of the 5 states marked off my list, I only had 1 more to pursue. I think it's time to head north. Before finishing out the video, I'd like to take a step back and talk more about some of the valuable gear I was using throughout this trip.
Well, with this being one of my first entrances into East Coast fishing, it's been a little bit of a learning curve, and I'd like to kind of slow things down right now and talk a little bit more about how I'm catching these fish, because out west and even in the Midwest, techniques and tactics that I like to use are mostly rendered useless, and it forces a little bit of learning, a little bit of growth, and I want to just talk about some basics. So my rods, my flies, maybe some stuff in my bag, and then maybe finish it off with some wading gear. But I'd like to get things started with the rods. And so this entire time I have been carrying 2 rods, and this is pretty standard for me. No matter where I'm at, I think it's kind of like a golf analogy. You don't go out to your nearest course and take a driver, and that's it. You don't go out there and just take a putter. You want a tool that can cover various applications, and that's what I see with a 5-weight and with a 3-weight. Now, this 5-weight it's an absolute beast, and I found that even though the water is smaller, just in a more general sense, there are still really deep pools or wide portions of the river where having a longer rod helps, and having a little bit of casting space, you can have a presentation and be a little bit more sneaky. And the 5-weight is where I like to keep any streamers that I'm throwing, any dry dropper rigs that I'm throwing, but I'm also using it for single dry fly use. It's still good there. But this is a very versatile rod, and I like the length of it. So again, that might seem counterintuitive when you see some of the places that I've been fishing for these brookies. It's like a coffin. Everything is a hallway. The rhododendron are just reaching down to grab you. But having this length does make a difference when you're using your bow and arrow casts, or even when you're doing just kind of dapping, or just trying to almost like use it like a cane pole. Having that extra length can get you to those fish a little bit easier than something like a 3-weight. But speaking of the 3-weight, this has kind of been the bread and butter throughout this entire trip. These fish on average aren't going to be that big, so having something with a little bit more give is nice, so you're not flinging them into next week. But it's also nice, again, the kind of in opposite sense, but in the same vein, when you're in these hallway like streams where you have every rhododendron branch trying to grab your line, having a smaller rod like this, lengthwise at least, you can really get in there and roll cast in really tight spaces. And something that I've done that maybe some of you blue liners do too is I've actually upped the line on my reel here. So I am using a 3-weight rod, but I have 4-weight creek line on. And it's not the best in like a double haul situation, but for roll cast specifically, you can really, in tight spaces, just rocket that thing in there. And I've caught a lot of fish doing that. And this, you can run a dry dropper, you can certainly run a streamer on it, but this one's been mostly just my dry fly rig. So yeah, it's reliable, like I said. But yeah, like talking about the flies that I'm throwing, let's actually look at my box and kind of break down what I've been throwing this entire time. So this right here is uncommon for me. I usually have 3 or 4 different boxes, 1 dry fly box, 1 nymph box, and a whole different streamer wallet, or a streamer box if I can carry it. It's interesting about this kind of fishing, you don't need a whole lot of flies. It's really simple in that instance. I've got one side that is, your nymphs and streamers, and then the other side which is just dry flies. And I would say the majority of the fish that I've caught, from Georgia to Virginia, have all been on the dry. And that's the thing about these creeks, and maybe as you've watched this video and you can kind of see it for yourself, there's not a whole lot of bug life.
a lot of their forage is going to be coming from the surrounding streams. And especially this time of year, as spring is moving into summer, this is an amazing time for fish to be eating. You'll have crickets, you'll have any sort of grasshoppers that are starting to hatch, even the bugs that are hatching on the stream, ants, beetles, whatever it is, there's forage all over the place. And that's what these fish really key in on, especially in those higher elevation situations. And you can kind of equate it to your high alpine cutthroat or any high alpine stream where growing seasons are short. That's the thing. A lot of these fish, they can't be picky. They are in small pools, and whatever they see drifting by, they really need to go get. So that's why fly choice, again, it's not that much of a puzzle. You're not going to be following any sort of hatches for the most part. Maybe on some lower elevation streams or in some stock streams, you could definitely run into a hatch. I'm not saying you can't, but I found that the bigger, the bushier, the more buoyant especially the fly is, the more success you're going to have. Because when you really get into them, you're going to be drying off your flies a lot. And that's another thing that I want to talk about real quick is kind of the shake and bake that I use to keep my flies afloat. Okie doke, as I'm diving into my bag, no affiliation to Loon, but I find them to be some of the better products out there. I call this shake and bake. So you have a dry desiccant, and then you have a oil, petroleum based, whatever this actually is. Fly goop, fly gunk. You dry it and then you kind of coat it with this to help it stay afloat. And that's the main thing that I use. And after every single fish, your fly gets doused. I just think it's so important for presentation. If you really want to do it right, I mean, you can swish it out, you can try and blow it, put it on your clothes and dry it out, but it just doesn't do as good of a job as something like this. So keeping this in your front pocket, I have it in a side pocket. Keeping it handy makes it so much easier to transition right after you let that fish go to boom, dry fly, casting to the next one with a very good presentation. And speaking of letting that fish go, I want to talk about two things now with regards to maybe netting your fish, and if you want to, taking a picture of it. Now, it's no secret that I keep a ton of junk in my bag at all times. I usually have a very heavy bag by the end of the day, but two things that I think would be important for you in this kind of situation would be a smaller net and something like this viewing box. And this is relatively new. It's something that I thought would be a good idea to bring out here. It's a great way to highlight the fish. If you do want to take a picture of them, it has minimal handling. You put them in here, they're sitting in water, so you're never keeping them too far away from their home for that long. And it's a great way to get a clean shot of these fish. And that way, minimal stress, you can release them, because everybody likes to take a picture of their little brookies. They're beautiful, so why wouldn't you? But at the same time, you can appreciate them almost from a distance and really, lower that time of exposure to your hands or just the air in general. That can, especially in lower elevations, that can really hurt those fish. So, yeah. I think the last, but certainly not least thing that we need to talk about here as far as gear goes would be the weighting. Now, when it comes to weighting, there are so many different opinions, and really it comes down to your own personal preference. I'm more so in the camp of wet weighting, so I like to start things off pretty early as I can. I got down here in kind of early to mid-spring, so air temps, especially down in the south, up in the mountains, we're still cold. We're talking mid-50s, even up into certain days in the 60s, you're still going to be really cold on the water. So I like to help bolster my layers with a little bit more in the way of neoprene pants. You can get these anywhere. These are more just like kayaking or paddleboarding pants. I think this is NRS is the brand. Really reliable, and it's a great to layer these underneath a pair of jeans. You can wear your shorts over them. It doesn't really matter, but I find that these are really great to help, again, protect your knees when you smash it against rocks, but then also that thermal barrier that it provides between your skin and the very cold mountain water. It can make or break a day, but that's more of an ancillary thing, especially as spring moves into summer. These won't be necessary, but what is necessary are your boots, and picking the right pair of boots, I think, is in a lot of ways make or break. These have a lovely, bottom here where you have the ability to screw on metal studs, and I can't tell you how many times they've saved my life. The metal is a great way to grip onto the rocks, and I think felt is legal in a lot of places out here. I know out west it's either frowned upon or is just straight up not legal. So check your regulations, maybe consider a pair of felt boots, but just know that you can't really bring them to many other watersheds. But yeah, the folks that I've talked to, the other anglers that I've been with, they use them, and felt is very effective. But yeah, for me, these metal studs, I can't tell you how interesting it is to go from Midwest gravel to Western freestones. Even the Western freestones can't even compare. Like the way that the bottoms are so slippery, be it just like the straight slate bottoms or the big boulders, it's just, yeah, it's one of those things where you're gonna be twisting your ankles, you're gonna be hurting your knees. It's just one of those things where you might fall a couple times a day if you don't have something like the metal or the felt to help keep you up. But hopefully that gives you a better understanding of some of the stuff in my bag, my rods, as well as what I'm wearing to wade. But in reality, all this gear talk could be putting the cart before the horse. Without prior research, all of the information I just listed would be as good as useless. Well, this is a little weird because technically this is months in advance of ever making my way out to the Southern Appalachians, but I think it's important to talk about because with all my trips, and especially for bigger ones like this, I do a boatload of research. I mean, I'm creating outlines and waypoint maps months and months and months in advance so that when I do actually hit the ground, I'm hitting the ground running. And I'm being as efficient as possible with limited time. So my normal research process, for those of you out there who may not know, is books. Books are the cornerstone, and it can be very hit and miss depending on where you go. I find that a lot of Western style angling guidebooks are very reliable and give you an amazing picture of the overall watersheds in states like Wyoming or Idaho, Montana. But for this East Coast venture, I have found a lot of these books to be mostly unreliable. And that's not to throw shade at any of the authors. I'm just unimpressed, that's all. But so after my books, I'll go to internet articles, and those have varying results because any Joe Schmo can just get on there and write them. And if you can go back in the archives, it could be at as early as I don't know, 2010. And in my opinion, and same goes for the copyrights on these kind of books, I like to find pieces of information that are within the last 5 to 10 years. Anything past a decade and you're getting a little bit squirrely on, is this reliable? Does this still hold up? Have things changed? Because, I mean, even in just a few years, a watershed can see a big flood, or especially out west, fires can decimate an area, and it's not the same as when the author of the book or the article wrote that piece. So be careful with that, and that's why I use my tertiary source, that being videos, because then you can actually get a visual on the places you're trying to go or fish, or the areas at, worst case scenario. And when it comes to fishing, use your search results, I guess, in varying ways. So don't just search for fishing, search for kayaking, search for canoeing, search for hiking. It gives you at least little pieces of that puzzle to say, oh wow, the rhododendron here is really thick, or oh wow, that's a much wider creek than I expected, or oh man, the fire from 2018 decimated the area and it still looks pretty rough. But I say all that to say that, research for this particular trip has been more frustrating than most any I've had in the last few years. And my fail-safe when the books are unreliable and the articles just don't match up and videos are single POV GoPros that don't give you any information, I like to start making calls. And I'll cold call conservation agencies, DNRs, and even Forest Service, wherever you are in the country, just to try and get information. And what's been so interesting to me is the different perspectives from the various DNRs that I've had conversations with throughout this project. So I don't know if I want to name names just yet, but for this trip in particular, I have had no end of trouble finding good information. And so anywhere that you've seen and anywhere that I've gone, I'm going to go ahead and list the information that I use to find these brook trout down in the description below. And This is kind of a fun fact for those of you who are willing enough to actually, go to that after the video's over. I do that for a lot of my films or videos. The information's down there. It's all public. I found it just doing the old Google searches. It's not a secret, it's out there. So yeah, use your resources and go find these awesome opportunities because they're on public land, they're for your use, and the more people that know about the Southern Appalachian brook trout, the more people ought to care. And yeah, then maybe try and change the rules and regulations and then protect these damn fish. So I will get off my high horse and just say that the research for this trip was awfully hard. But we're finding the fish, so let's get back to the video and find some more. Chapter 5, Fish of the Commonwealth. It was a bright and beautiful day, but I truly felt like I was walking in the dark of the night. Crossing the border from North Carolina, this would be my first time ever stepping foot into the state of Virginia. I've heard it's for lovers, but outside of that, I'm almost embarrassed to admit how little I know about the land and water within these lines. Geographically isolated from population centers like Richmond, Norfolk, and Charlottesville, where I was walking is supposed to be the furthest northern range of the Southern Appalachian brook trout. What little southern strain brookies are left in the area are primarily found in the mountainous regions straddling the southern border of Virginia and North Carolina. This is where I'll be spending the majority of my time hunting for the state fish of the Commonwealth. With extremely limited publication on these isolated pockets, this would end up being much easier said than done in most cases.
Oh, that was good.
It came as a slight shock that there are over 3,000 miles of trout streams within the borders of this relatively obscure state. Just in my little angling sphere, states like Virginia, they just sit so far on the peripheral of my known radar. Some of the more common names like Whitetop Laurel, the various forks of the Holston, and the New River system would frequently show up in my research, plus the sheer amount of water sitting within the borders of Shenandoah National Park. What's amazing to me is that the vast majority of those trout waters listed are supposedly still home to the native brook trout. On first glance, this might come as a welcome surprise to a fellow like myself in the business of brookies. Unfortunately, in my case, the vast majority of those are the mid-Atlantic strain. So, even though this was my last state on the list and the final chapter of this story, everything about my final experiences were far from least. It might be a stretch, but the few adventures in this weird corner of Appalachia might have been some of my most memorable. As I was snaking my way up the mostly empty backroads of seemingly sleepy settlements, the sheer amount of land set aside for agriculture and livestock grazing did give me a bit of pause. Lower in the system, many of the blue lines shown on the map ran dirty brown from bank degradation. It wasn't until the fields gave way to towering trees sitting atop solitary mountains did I feel my senses start to settle. As the friendly breeze carried the smell and sound of water, this empty parking lot told me it was time to find some fish.
I'm not sure what my options are going to be like getting down. My fork's not too far away. It's tempting to go down right now. Yeah, let's head down now.
I've definitely seen water in worse shape, but the softened color was a lingering symptom of last night's warm rain. There were plenty of signs all around, but these humid thunderstorms moving through were simply another sign of my Appalachia spring giving way to early summer. Now, just from what I'd seen up until this point, colored water wasn't exactly great for brook trout fishing. It was hard to tell how much water had moved through this little corridor overnight, and to what degree these fish might have been displaced. Resilience does seem to be one of their more noticeable characteristics, so I was fairly confident they wouldn't have gone all that far. What was working against me, and what you may have noticed yourself, is that these fish tend to be visual predators. Even with proportionally big eyes, a silty stream can hide the shadow cast by most any stream-bound bug. I should have maybe thought about that sentiment a bit sooner, because doggedly I threw cast after cast with my dry fly rod, only to be met with silence. I was moving up the tiered waterfalls rather fast, and yet again my Missouri roots were starting to bleed through. All I needed was for the fish gods to show me a damn fish. If it weren't for yet another new and unique stream to distract my curious mind, I may have been moved to frustration a touch faster. Getting desperate, I switched to my small streamer rig on the trusty 5-weight and was praying to just provoke something, anything into action. Folks, I'd welcome a damn creek chub with open arms at this point.
I just saw one. I spooked it, but it's here. Had one hooked.
Last but certainly not least, ladies and gentlemen, that Virginia brook trout right there completes the Southern Appalachian Slam. Now, I've seen a lot of brook trout at this point, and again, I'm shocked at the distinct beauty of these isolated fish. Those long, pronounced paw markings create such a cool pattern when blended with the sandy underbelly. This right here was an extremely satisfying first fish. Better late than never, but right at the waterfall barrier, I finally managed to put the pieces together. Now, I started my day out at only around 1,500 feet of elevation and climbed to about 2,000. This was a lot lower than most streams I'd seen so far. One thing I did notice, and again, this could have been due to the shifting seasons, but the water, it felt kind of warm. With as much time as I've spent in a trout stream, I almost come to expect the bite of frigid water. For whatever reason, the sting of Stewart Creek was oddly absent today. However, turning around and walking back downstream, the frequency of bites told me that these fish didn't seem to mind the warmer water all that much. And going back to my bass fishing days of old, I found that pitching and flipping a heavy-weighted streamer into the boulder pockets and fast water seams resulted in some pretty incredible hookups. They may not have been able to see my dry fly, but they could certainly feel the vibrations of my streamer twitching by. Those may have been my last fish at this particular creek, but they were far from my last fish here in the state. Just a little ways up the road, I found myself at an even lower elevation. I was almost sure there would be no brookies living in this kind of a stream, but I pushed on just to be sure.
Alright. I guess this is the creek. Seem to be a lot of down trees in this little creek.
This may sound a touch silly, but this kind of creek really reminds me of some creeks back home in Missouri. Just with all the critters in it, the various fish species. Yeah, the brook trout maybe not so much, not really a reminder of home, but yeah, just the way this corridor runs and the trees and everything, it's yeah, it's neat to see how, you know, varied these habitats can be.
That's good fish. That bow and arrow cast lives rent-free in my noggin. That was such a cool spot and stock situation, and talk about a prize. Much like his brookie brothers from down the holler, this fish shared the more pronounced par markings. Almost as if knowing he'd end up being the brookie bookend to this whole journey, I sat and observed this fish just a little bit longer. Some of the furthest northern relics of this southern strain were sitting right in front of my own eyes, and as he swam back strong to enjoy an oncoming summer, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Walking out of this stream, the thought did hit me, and it kind of made me sad. I wondered when I'd be able to hold one of these special fish again. You know, it could be a while. Hell, it could be never again. Who knows what might happen? All I know is that the humid sweat clung tight to my raincoat as my heart clung tight to these many months of memories. What an incredible trip.
Well, as you can probably see behind me, the green foliage is in full force. The beauty of spring has sprung, and it is clearly getting to be summer. I'm sitting out in a long sleeve and I'm sweating, but this trip for me is coming to its close. I leave in a couple days. I think I'll leave on Friday, so it's yeah, it's a little bittersweet sitting here thinking, man, what an amazing trip. And I've tried to calm down and reflect on this a little bit more, and I think it might be valuable for me to sit down and discuss this a little bit, because prior to this entire trip, I would put myself in a bit of a I don't know, uninformed category. I just didn't know what this was like, you know, coming from the Midwest and the West. The pull of small fish in slippery creeks, in very crowded watersheds, just, it never got me. And especially, I had limited time. So back in college, or even when I first started with the whole professional world, you know, I had 2 weeks of vacation, or, you know, spring break was only a week. Like, I didn't have time to, you know, put myself in a really cool part of the world and experience it. And yeah, I gotta be honest, folks, I have kind of fallen in love. And if you've been following along with the whole Instagram side of things, you might see that I've been having a love affair of sorts with all the salamanders that are here. God bless America. I'm a fly fisherman by day and a herpetologist by night. I love anything creepy crawly, salamanders, lizards, turtles, you name it. It's frogs. How can I forget frogs? Anything like that I love. And being that this is kind of ground zero for some of the best salamander habitat in the world, it's just been so fun to get to experience, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much. I do want to sit here for a second and talk about, you know, the environment, some of the fishing, and again, just how unexpected this all was for me, and truly how I've fallen in love. You know, I wanted this to be more of a fish-focused
documentary style video. So yeah, the whole goal of this was to, hopefully you learned something about these fish. I know just in the research and in the filming and all the people I got to talk to, I've learned so much about these cool char. I mean, it's amazing that we have these here and that, you know, groups are working really hard to preserve what we have and then even grow their populations, you know, bringing them back to what they were before a little bit of, colonial American, Euro-American interjection. But anyway, with regards to the environment, again, coming from the West, this always kind of seemed like, oh, there's smaller mountains, lower elevation, they just got a bunch of trees out there, very cool. But the flora and fauna at every turn has, it's really made me rethink my feelings towards that. Coming here when the trees were all barren and getting to see kind of the skeleton forest, it was kind of amazing because you could see the contrast in the overlapping hills, or mountains I should say, and then all of a sudden, like a snap of a finger, it exploded into the most vibrant, beautiful, I mean, and I should say every color under the rainbow, from reds to oranges to pinks. It just was just this explosion of life. And not only in the canopy, but on the forest floor too, you know, all the wildflowers and ferns and just the green of the moss. I mean, I don't know if you guys can see this color behind. I mean, it's like a fluorescent, it's like this neon green. It's unbelievable. And then, you know, the natural side of things with the elements. Some of these storms that came through, I've never seen rain like that in my life. Like a Midwest storm, it'll come through and it'll hit hard like a swift right hook. But this, I mean, just pervasive downpour. I've never experienced anything like it. So getting to be here for that, so the explosion of spring and then all the different elements, like these foggy clouds and these thick hazes. I mean, it's just, I don't know, it's amazing. And then, yeah, you think about all the critters where, obviously I'm a little bit partial to the amphibians, all the cool species. I mean, that was such a fun aspect to be able to explore. But then something that also really kind of caught me off guard was the birds. There are so many migratory species of birds that come in and out of this Appalachian environment, and it is just gorgeous. It's a cacophony. Every morning I've been coming out, I walk to this very spot and I stand and I just listen, and I get out my phone and I click my Merlin bird app. I don't know if you guys have seen that thing. It is so cool. You can, you know, press record and it listens to all the bird calls. And I think one morning I had like 20. I'm not even kidding. There was like 20 different birds just in this one little hillside. So that's been really cool. Yeah, and like some of the more charismatic megafauna. Got to see a couple black bears. I almost hit one. That was pretty crazy. But then the elk and all the deer and everything, it's maybe a little bit more subdued than the West. You're not worried about turning the corner and seeing a grizzly bear or the wolves, but the element is still there. Like knowing that they're still in the area is still like, ooh, that's pretty nuts. Like, oh, it's kind of crazy. But as far as the fishing goes, yeah, again, it's a bit of a surprise. Now, I grew up on small streams. Like back home in Missouri, that was kind of my forte. I learned on these like really tiny systems, really technical, you know, working on your bow and arrow, working on your roll cast. And that really reminded me, the technique at least, of these streams. But these streams in general couldn't have been more different to anything that I've ever seen. You know, in the kind of the southern ranges, you had these sandy bottom, like really tight environments. Then as you moved up kind of into the mountains, high elevation, these big mossy boulders and these plunge pools. It's so fun. It's something that you could do for a lifetime. Like I imagine a world where you find a blue line, you got to stimulate it in a 3-weight, and you spend the rest of eternity just following that thing until it ends. It's such a fun way to fish, and I can see why people out here love the blue lining scene, because you can get to the wilder aspects of, you know, these mountains. And yeah, I don't know. I was warned that it would be crowded, and I got to experience that a little bit. Some of the lower elevation streams, yeah, I could see how, you know, this gets crazy in the summertime, especially when tourists are coming around. But everywhere that I've been, and granted, I've been mainly focusing on brook trout, I haven't seen many folks, and it's been so fun to get lost in the solitude of a singular mountain stream, you know, these staircase pools just going up and, yeah, seeing what lives in them. So
I couldn't recommend this region more, and I couldn't recommend coming during the spring. Again, it might not be as easy with vacation schedules and time off and everything, and I'm sure not everybody has 2 months to dedicate to a project like this, but I would highly recommend at least putting this on your bucket list for someday down the road. But yeah, folks, I think that's more than enough for me. I think it's time to wrap this video up.
If you've somehow made it to this point in the film, I gotta commend you, friend. This was not a short video, and your patience to sit through this all means the world to me. Now, this might all seem like a lot of work just to tell the simple story of a small char species that most folks don't even give a shit about. And don't get me wrong, it was a lot of work. But all the filming, research, and edits pale in comparison to the eons it took Mother Nature to create the Southern Appalachian brook trout. I really hope, if you're still watching, you care a little bit more about these fish, whether or not you fish for them or just have seen them for the first time here. Because personally, after all the conversations and the actual time in country, it's clear that in this constantly changing world, their future is uncertain. And I promise I'm not saying that to be hyperbolic. The one major roadblock with regards to restorations, surveys, and further genetic research all start with the mighty dollar bill. I've never asked y'all to buy some bullshit merchandise line or to purchase a film blocked behind a paywall just to release for free a year later. What I am asking, however, is for you to help these fish. I know I mentioned this earlier, but Flow Season, the various partners, and some of the friends of the channel have already pledged a certain amount to be donated to brook trout conservation. It really bugs me to say this, but much like anything else in this silly world, money moves the meter. There's a link down below that you can follow to donate directly to the National Parks Fishery Division if you have the means and feel moved enough to do so. The last thing I want to do is sit here and guilt or pressure you into doing something, especially when money's tight and times are kind of tough. However, the clock is ticking, and from what I've seen, these fish seem to be in a vulnerable spot. The initial impact of change has hit and hemorrhaged across Appalachia. Patchwork restoration projects and protection of a few intact systems have preserved the pulse, but it's mere fractions of what it once was. Naturally, one bad flash flood or low water year could completely douse out entire clades of these special fish. Failed barriers and continued pressure from fisheries mismanagement isn't doing them any favors in the meantime. God, I mean, I really hate to sound so doom and gloom, but the whole reason for pursuing this project was to highlight the plight of these amazing fish. All I will say to close out this video is thank you for watching all the way through and following this brook trout journey to its end. And folks, wherever you find yourself, be it in the old growth groves of Southern Appalachia, chasing square tails in the shade, or just in your backyard, I sure hope you keep your feet in the water, and until next time, tight lines.